Ramananjali, Ramananjali, Loka Kalyana, Ramana Sharananjali, Ramananjali, Ramananjali, Ramananjali.
Namo Ramana, prostrations to Ramana, shining as the self in all beings. We at Ramana Maharshi Centre for Learning, Bangalore, are celebrating our 40 plus years of Ramananjali with the national seminar as well as a global online festival. It's a matter of great joy and honor to us that David Godman has been kind enough to give us a series of talks on Bhagavan and Muruganar. We'll be presenting today the first of this three-part series by David Godman. Ramananjali is that body of music which is dedicated to poems by Bhagavan and on Bhagavan. It consists of the musical form of all the poetic compositions of Bhagavan in Tamil, in Malayalam, in Telugu and in Sanskrit. This includes the 5 hymns to Arunachala, the miscellaneous poems, the Upadesha Saram and the Ulladinarpadal. Ramananjali also includes the music to the poetic compositions of Ganapati Muni on Bhagavan in the Ramana Chatvarimshat, in some chapters of the Ramana Gita, as well as parts of Umar Sahasram and a few other stray poems. And then it includes all the compositions of Muruganar's Ramana Sannidhi Murai with representative verses from each of the titles of Ramana Sannidhi Murai and a few compositions of Muruganar from Ramananubhuti, Ramana Sharana Pallandu and Ramana Deva Male. It also includes all the compositions of Sadhu Om Swami in a representative manner from each of the titles and compositions on Bhagavan by Shuddhananda Bharati, Manavasi Ramaswamy Iyer, Ramanadasa Sadananda, Murugaya Pankajakshi and many other poets who have had darshan of Bhagavan and been inspired to write poetry on him. Ramananjali also includes compositions of contemporary poets on Bhagavan and a whole vast body of translations of Bhagavan's compositions and Muruganar, Muni and Sadhu Om's compositions into Kannada, Telugu, Malayalam, Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi and English as well. It gives us great joy to present today David Godman on Bhagavan and Muruganar.
This is David Godman speaking from a recording studio in the University of Western Australia. I've been invited to give a series of short talks on Muruganar, his writings, and his long association with Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. Before we start, I should say that is Muruganar sitting next to Bhagavan in a photo that was taken in the mid-1920s, I would say. Muruganar was born in 1890 in Ramanathapuram, which is a district in the southern part of modern-day Tamil Nadu. His original name was C.K. Subramanya Iyer, but his family preferred to call him Sambamurti, and in later life he adopted the name Muruganar because of its long historical association with the Tamil cultural tradition. After school, he decided to train as a teacher and became a very accomplished Tamil Pandit. He taught Tamil language and literature at Norwich Girls' High School in Madras, and occasionally he also took on private students and gave private tuition. He was very, very good at being a Tamil Pandit, and his excellence in that department caused him to be headhunted by a committee which had been convened to bring into being a definitive Tamil dictionary that was based on the same principles as the Oxford Dictionary. That is to say, instead of just having definitions for words, the dictionary would cover the whole history of the language. It would show how usage had changed through the centuries, so you could look up a particular word and you could find out how one poet, one writer, one playwright had used the word 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1500 years ago, and so on. This was a massive undertaking, and when it finally came out in 1923, I think, there were 8 huge volumes, probably occupying about this much of shelf space. Muruganar worked on this project for, I think, about 5 years, and here he is. This is the first photo we know of Muruganar sitting on the left with his turban, looking a bit shy, like he's the new boy in the department. So I would say this is quite early in his association with the committee. I think he worked from 1915, when he was 25, to 1920, when he was 30. This was his main money-earning activity during that time. In his spare time, in addition to continuing to study Tamil literature in all its forms, he was also an ardent nationalist, as were most other young men of his period. I don't know if he was politically active in the sense of going on demonstrations or campaigns, but I do know that he composed a lot of poetry in which he was exhorting fellow Indians to rise up against the British and to campaign, strive for and attain independence. Long after he came to Bhagavan, his poems were published in a book called Sutantara Geetam, but by that time Muruganar had lost all interest in politics and didn't really care anything about his poems or the book. He did have one other driving ambition at this period, and that was to find himself a guru who needed to have very strict and well-defined qualifications. The guru that he wanted was going to be somebody who would model the relationship that the Tamil saint Manikavachika had with Shiva 1,000 years ago. So I need to explain that story a little bit in order to establish exactly what kind of relationship Muruganar was looking for. Shiva had somehow spotted Manikavachika, who was the chief minister of the Pandyan kingdom, and decided that he was a mature devotee who needed a human guru who would bestow grace on him and bring about his liberation. So he decided to take the form of a guru and sit under a tree in a place where he knew Manikavachika was going to come. Manikavachika, meanwhile, had been commissioned by the king to go to the port of Parantarai to buy a herd of horses for the king and the kingdom. Horses were big-ticket items. They were very rare, very valuable, so it was a very big commission involving a lot of money. Manikavachika was given a huge amount of the king's treasury to go and buy these horses. On his way to the port, he encountered Shiva in the form of this human guru sitting under a tree. Manikavachika instantly fell in love with him. He surrendered to him, and worse than that, he actually handed over all the king's money to him instead of going to the port and buying the horses. Because Manikavachika had surrendered so completely, Shiva sorted out his domestic problems with the king. All ended well after lots of dramatic adventures. When Shiva decided it was time for him to leave, he told Manikavachika that he was being commissioned to sing songs, to travel all over the Tamil region and sing songs that would praise the greatness of Shiva, his guru, and spread the word of the greatness of Shiva throughout the Tamil regions. So this is the story that Muruganar had in his mind. This was the blueprint, if you like, for the model of the relationship that he wanted for a guru. Now, this is what he wrote many years later. Will I, an unworthy ignorant one, ever be accepted as a devotee by Lord Shiva, who, as the divine guru with the wealth of grace, showed clearly to the world the greatness of Manikavachika? And even if I get such a chance, will I be able to sing of the glories of his grace, showering feet in the same way as Tiruvachikam, Manikavachika's most famous poetic work? So this was the setup, if you like. This was what he was hoping for. And somewhat miraculously, this very narrow defined set of qualifications manifested in Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi, and Muruganar came to hear of him through a devotee who had lived at Skandashram, and he was called Dandapani Swami, and there was a family connection. So this is Dandapani Swami, taken in the early 1920s. Muruganar had a wife, Meenakshi. Wasn't particularly good relationships, as far as I can work out, but Meenakshi's father, Dandapani Swami, had lived at Skandashram in the last years of its existence, and when Bhagavan moved down the hill to start the ashram around the mother's samadhi, Dandapani was one of the leading lights of the ashram, helped set it up, helped develop it, and so much so that I think in the last 2 or 3 years of the 1920s up till 1929, he was actually the ashram manager. So Dandapani Swami he knew that Muruganar, his son-in-law, was a big Tamil Pandit who loved Tamil poetry, and he was also a devotee of Bhagavan, so he thought he would try to interest his son-in-law in Bhagavan as a guru by showing him one of Bhagavan's poems. So he arrived in Madras with a copy of Aksharamanamallai, which was the poem that Bhagavan had composed in 1913 as a song for his devotees to sing as they went begging through the streets of Tiruvannamalai. Muruganar, when he looked at the verses, he had his pandit's hat on, if you like. When you're a Tamil Pandit and someone gives you a Tamil poem to read, the first thing you look at is the literary style, how well the poet has arranged his ideas, got his meters, his rhymes, etc. All the literary devices are in perfect running order. But having started off analysing it as a Tamil Pandit, he soon became aware that this poem had been written by someone who was convincingly claiming that he had attained oneness with Shiva, to the point where he was more or less claiming that he was one with Shiva as Arunachala Shiva. Now this made his ears prick up, if you like. This was the person he was looking for. There was something about the verses that made Muruganar think, maybe this is the man who I've been waiting for, maybe this is the person who I can have the guru relationship with. So let's see the next one. So he was enormously impressed by this first reading, and many years later, when he was writing Ramana Sanadi Marai, one of the verses he wrote, this is Dandapani Swami again, by the way, one of the verses he wrote was, "Glory to him who, by showing me the beauty of his Aksharamanamallai verses, brought me under his rule, irredeemably enslaving me to his feet, even though I was an unworthy person." So the verses clearly had an enormous effect on him. Having had that first introduction to Bhagavan through his father-in-law, through the Aksharamanamallai verses, I think other people started to make themselves known to him, people who had known Bhagavan and been impressed by him. And there's another verse which is coming up next. And this is what he also wrote in Ramana Sanadi Marai. He's talking about how Bhagavan had appeared in his consciousness, how he'd made himself known. He said, like many other thoughts that arose to my mind, this thought, a long time ago, appeared and disappeared like a flash of lightning manifesting in the sky. Then I heard from devotees who had redeemed themselves by taking as their support the grace of the one at Tiruvannamalai, who is the embodiment of true jnana and who shines as the flame of true tapas. When they spoke of the greatness of his grace, they melted in joy. Hearing them, I was lost in admiration and unceasing joy. The compassionate Supreme One, who is endowed with jnana, then decided in his heart to be my Lord and Master. Now look at this last paragraph. This is very evocative of the Manikavachika story. Shiva himself had somehow noticed Manikavachika, had decided he was a mature devotee, and had taken a human form in order to have the transaction with Manikavachika which would result in his liberation. So Muruganar is saying, with a little bit of hindsight, that before Bhagavan had even met him, seen him, somehow he had shown up on Bhagavan's radar, and that Shiva, in the form of Ramana Maharshi, had decided in his own heart to be Muruganar's Lord and Master, to attract him and to liberate him. So, after having read the verses his father-in-law Dandapani had given, he talked to these other people. He'd somehow come to the conclusion that Bhagavan was waiting for him. He made a pilgrimage to Tiruvannamalai. This was, I think he probably met Dandapani Swami early in 1923, or got the verses in 23. He showed up in Tiruvannamalai for the first time in September 1923, and instead of going straight to Ramanashram, he went to the Arunachalaswara temple in Tiruvannamalai, and there he composed his first verses on Bhagavan and other topics as well. So I'll just put in a word about this photo because I love it. The tree in the foreground was a huge Bodhi tree that was planted by Kandaswami. He was the man who planted all the big trees at Skandashram. Some of them are still there. This is a Bodhi tree outside the temple of Guhai Namah Shivaya, where Bhagavan also lived. And for many, many decades, this was the most noticeable. It's a single solitary enormous tree on the lower slopes of Arunachala. Unfortunately, it died. It got some disease a few years ago, and now it's just an abandoned stump. But this for me, was one of my favorite trees on the mountain for a long, long time. So Muruganar went to the temple, and he composed these 11 verses. You can see from the verses that he's on a kind of, he's at a tipping point in his life. He has a history of political, I wouldn't say activism, but he's writing poetry, exhorting people to go out and campaign for independence. And also he's very much attracted to Ramana Maharshi and the idea that Bhagavan is his guru. So some of the verses are actually complaints to Bhagavan saying, why are you sitting there doing nothing when the country needs everybody to rise up and campaign for independence? So there's this get up and go complaint. But a lot of the verses are quite clearly, they quite clearly reveal that Muruganar has already accepted him as a great guru, as someone who can grant him liberation. And he knows that he's going to go to Bhagavan as a supplicant, as someone who wants to be accepted as a devotee for this Siva manifestation in human form, who he is firmly convinced lives in Tiruvannamalai. So he writes his poems. He walks off to Ramanashram, which in these days looked like that. So this is the earliest known photo of Ramanashram. This is the coconut leaf hut that was erected over the Mother's Samadhi in the second half of 1922. The photographer is not known, but he came for one day in 1922. He took 3 absolutely stunningly gorgeous pictures of Ramanashram at its very beginnings. This is one. I will show you another in a minute. What I want to mention here is that Bhagavan lived in that hut over his mother's Samadhi from around the end of 1922 until 1928, when the old hall was constructed. So here we have a very sacred place. His mother was a jnani. Her Samadhi is inside that coconut leaf hut, and that was amplified, magnified. The sanctity of it was amplified and magnified by having Bhagavan live in that place for 5 or 6 years before space constraints forced him out into the old hall where he lived for another 20, 25 years. So this is a very major power spot, in my opinion. Don't be fooled by the rather tumble-down look of it. It's not a coconut leaf hut. This is a temple containing the samadhi of one jnani, in which lived another jnani for many, many years. Muruganar shows up at this particular hut, and unlike the day this photo was taken, there was nobody there. He hovered around outside, not quite sure what the protocol was, and Bhagavan inside sensed that there was somebody outside looking for him, so he came out and said, Yena. Yena in Tamil just means what? To Western ears it might sound a bit curt and abrupt, but this is a standard way of ascertaining what business a visitor to a Tamil home has, what do they want, why have they come, what can I do for you, all summed up in that one word. Now Muruganar pulled out his sheet of 11 verses, cleared his throat, and then attempted to sing them. Muruganar, being a pandit, knew that certain meters, certain themes demanded certain songs, certain ragas, and up till that point he was very insistent that all of his verses be chanted or sung with the correct raga, the correct melody. So he picked the one that he thought was the most appropriate for this particular sequence of verses, but he couldn't sing. There are two versions of this story. One of them comes from Ganeshan, who said he got the story from Muruganar, and Ganeshan said that after failing even to make it through the first verse, Bhagavan took pity on him, took the sheet of paper off him and said, here, let me read it for you. So Bhagavan himself held the paper and recited the verses that Muruganar had failed to read. So this is another photo that comes from the same day, and I like to think that this picture is somehow recreating the moment when Muruganar showed up, because there's Bhagavan in the foreground with the coconut leaf hut in the background, consulting a piece of paper. You can just imagine him standing there, reading correctly, properly, chanting Muruganar's 11 verses, because Muruganar's voice was breaking and he couldn't do it. So, again, later in Ramana Sannidhi Morai, Muruganar speaks of this day, and he said, Venkata, that's Ramana, whose being is bliss, overflowing and immeasurable, came out quick to meet this slave, and far from laughing in contempt, took me up and made me his own. How wonderful his grace. So Muruganar recognized that he was could be social anxiety, we don't know, but he simply couldn't recite, chant, or sing any of his verses. And somewhat mysteriously, that was it in terms of his chanting. After that, he said he could never chant any of his own verses. He composed thousands and thousands of them, but he left the chanting up to other people. After this one failed attempt to chant in Bhagavan's presence, he never again made any attempt. He would compose, he would hand them over, and other people would do the chanting for him. So what else went on during this first meeting? We've had Bhagavan reading the verses, Muruganar being tongue-tied, but there was also a very impressive transmission of power. Muruganar's mind just melted and disappeared in the presence. So this is the way he describes it many years later in one of the poems in Ramana Sannidhi Morai. In the same way that wax melts on encountering fire, on seeing his feet, my mind dissolved and lost its form. Like the calf finding its mother, my heart melted and rejoiced in his feet. The hairs on my body stood on end, and devotion surged in me like an ocean that has seen the full moon. Through the grace of Chit Shakti, the power inherent in consciousness, my soul was in ecstasy. With an unsteady and quivering voice, I read the 11 verses and placed them at his feet. At that very moment, he graciously looked at me with his lotus eyes. From that day on, the praises given out by my impartial tongue belonged only to him. From the way he bestowed his grace, becoming my lord and master, I was completely convinced that he was Shiva himself. As my new owner, he made I and mine his own. So here we have the act of surrender. He's come to Bhagavan. Bhagavan has given him a massive experience. He's felt the connection. He's surrendered. He also, incidentally, wrote that he managed to get through all 11 verses with a steady and quivering voice, so that's a slight discrepancy. maybe poetic license, maybe Bhagavan read 10, maybe he didn't, we don't know, but Muruganar did have immense difficulty in reading out his verses that day, and it seems that Bhagavan did help him out. Again, there's one little, have I gone? No, I've gone the wrong way here. So, this is a line-up at Ramanashram around the time that Muruganar first showed up. The man holding the sandals is Paramuswami. Next to him, behind him, is Muruganar. The big burly man in the middle of the front row is Dandapani Swami, and on the right there's Ramakrishna Swami, who was Bhagavan's attendant for several years in the 1920s and later. Before I move on to more Muruganar stuff, I just want to put in a word for Dandapani Swami. We've already seen that he was the person who was instrumental in bringing Muruganar to Bhagavan. He was an important figure in Ramanashram's early history. All of the stories I've heard about him are quirky and odd. I will tell one which is my favourite, simply because there he is in the picture looking large and impressive, and this story involves him looking large and impressive. In the late 1920s, as Bhagavan got to be more and more famous and popular, on festival days, lots and lots of people would start to walk around the hill. They would get to the ashram gate, and they would have been told, oh, there's a famous, powerful Swami in there, you should go in and pay your respects. So this resulted in a lot of increased traffic at the ashram, which nobody really wanted. They were just sightseers. So Dandapani Swami, you can't see on this black and white picture, but he had an orange kaupina and his danda, his staff. He decided he was going to sit on a podium at the ashram gate, not pretending to be Ramana Maharshi. He just thought, these people have come to see a Swami, they've come to pranam to a Swami. I'm going to sit there in my orange kaupina, and if that keeps people away from Bhagavan, then I've done a good day's work. So the devotees who knew who Bhagavan was just ignored Dandapani Swami. They walked in and had their darshan. But all the casual visitors who were just looking for a Swami to prostrate to, they saw this very large, very impressive Swami in his orange kaupina, sitting in Padmasana on a podium by the gate, and they thought this must be Ramana Maharshi, so they did their pranams and went on their way round the hill without bothering the people inside the ashram. Bhagavan was totally okay with this. He said, I don't mind so long as you don't put a sign there saying this is Ramana Maharshi. If people want to think that's me and go on their way, that's great, it's going to be quieter here. My own feeling is, from other stories that he's told, is that if people come to Ramanashram and they prostrate to somebody thinking that's Ramana Maharshi, then the pranams go straight to Ramana Maharshi. They just don't get the congestion in his living space. So I think he would have been totally okay with collecting people's pranams via Dandapani Swami down by the gate. Now this is Narasimha Swami. We're moving on to a new aspect of Muruganar's first visit to Ramanashram. I've talked about the great devotion that Muruganar showed up with. I've talked about the experience, the surrender. There was another aspect that he mentions a lot less, but B.V. Narasimha Swami seems to focus on almost exclusively in his account of Muruganar's first visit to Bhagavan. Narasimha Swami was Bhagavan's first biographer. Around the late 1920s, he took it on himself to collect as much biographical information as he could. He interviewed all the old devotees who'd had intimate contact. He travelled all over the Tamil region, talking to people, hunting for, hunting for old photos, basically trying to collect enough pieces of the jigsaw puzzle of Bhagavan's life to put together a coherent narrative of Bhagavan's early life up till 1930. We all owe a massive debt of gratitude to Narasimha Swami for all the stories he uncovered, all the accounts that he managed to collect from people. One of the people he interviewed, this is probably 1929 or 1930, was Muruganar, and this isn't Muruganar writing his own account. This is Narasimha Swami writing in English an account that Muruganar had told him. I don't think for 1 minute that this is how Muruganar himself would have described his first meeting with Bhagavan. We've already listened to his verses, how he described the event, the surrender, the feeling of having found his guru, the immense peace, the satisfaction he got from his first visit. This is a whole different incident that happened a couple of days after his arrival. So I will read this. Remember, this is Narasimha Swami writing down in English a story that Muruganar had told him in Tamil. So Narasimha Swami is translating Muruganar's narrative into English and making notes on what Muruganar said happened. 2 or 3 days after my arrival, I was given some medicine. I do not know what it was, but it excited me and overpowered me. I sat in front of the Maharshi and concentrated my mind on his person. After a few minutes, I had a vision of brightness. It was a suffused brightness all over his body and around it. The body was, however, distinct from the surrounding light. How long it lasted, I do not know. So wholly lost was I in contemplating the vision. Kanji Swami, Dandapani Swami, and Arunachala Swami were present while this was going on. Maharshi then appeared to me as Christ, for what reason I cannot say, and again as Muhammad and other great souls for similarly inexplicable reasons. So here we have a whole new dimension to the first visit. Muruganar does mention this. This is again from Ramana Sanadi Morai. To those who come to you, O Lord, your grace is like the ocean vast. When I, on service spent, had reached your feet, with smiling face you glanced at me, and at that moment you revealed to my mind's eye rare visions, various wonderful, never by man beheld before. So he's conceding that he has had these visions. He's not quite giving them the prominence that Narasimha Swami is. So remember, Narasimha Swami said that he had a vision of Christ and he also had a vision of Muhammad. And this is another verse from Ramana Sanadi Maharaj. It doesn't explicitly say that this is the vision he had on his first week at Ramanashram, but it does contain, oddly, Muhammad and Jesus and lots of other divine manifestations. So I think he's alluding indirectly to the fact that these are the people he saw when he came to Ramanashram for the first time. I should mention that there was a small group of sadhus who were associated with Bhagavan who used to take ganja. Bhagavan didn't approve. He told them he didn't approve, but they didn't stop. I rather suspect that one of them gave some kind of concoction to Muruganar, who rather innocently took it, as a result of which he started having divine visions in Bhagavan's presence, including seeing Muhammad and Jesus. So this is the verse that Muruganar wrote. Exalted One, great God Ramana, should I say that you are the Supreme? Should I say that you are the compassionate Christ? Should I say that you are a liberated person? Should I say that you are the Prophet Muhammad? Should I say that you are a Jnani? Should I say that you are an immaculate one, a Jain Arahat? Should I say you are the heroic Buddha? Should I say you are Shiva? Should I say you are his son, Kumara? Now we're back to Narasimha Swami's account. It's quite long, so I'm giving this out in installments. So Muruganar is still talking about his hallucinogenic or drug-inspired visions that he had in Bhagavan's presence. I lost my former personality during this period, for it was submerged and lost in a huge ocean wave of a new state of spirituality. I was feeling that all my experience was dreamlike, vague, insubstantial, and mysterious, in spite of the feeling that I was still in the waking condition. I was obsessed by this fear that my former worldly waking state was being smothered and my former self plundered of its sense of reality and individuality. I felt that, as a consequence, I might be perpetually held down to this strange life in Tiruvannamalai and be forever lost to my mother, whose sole support I was. So now he's getting a little bit paranoid, so I bawled out some words to the effect, "Here is a band of robbers called Siddhas, at whose head is this Ramana Maharshi. They're all intent on capturing souls who approach them in the waking condition and rapidly charming them into this mysterious siddhis sort of life and adding them to their group. As it would not be within the power of my mother or anyone else to see me or take me back from that iron clutch, I must start off from here at once. I also added, looking at this bright, dazzling figure of Maharshi and addressing him, so here I am, unable even for a few moments to endure this light. How wonderful it is that a woman, your mother, should have carried you in her womb for 9 long months. In this high-strung state and in this unique strain, I went on haranguing for over an hour, punctuating my remarks by repeated prostrations to Maharshi. After that, I wandered about here and there with Kanji Swami and Arunachala Swami, mostly around Palitirtham and the Chengam Road, till about 3 a.m. I felt that all attempts to escape from the ashram were futile, as the whole of Tiruvannamalai was giving me the same oppressive feeling. Submerging my personality, I felt that Tiruvannamalai and the Maharshi were coextensive and synonymous. Now, I came across this manuscript in the Ramanashram archives around 1980. It was clearly written in Narasimha Swami's handwriting. At that time, Kanji Swami was still around at Ramanashram. This, by the way, is Kanji Swami and Muruganar sitting outside Muruganar's room at Ramanashram, probably around 1970. So I was quite interested to know more about this episode in which Muruganar had had some kind of hallucinogenic experience, and that Kanji Swami and 1 or 2 other devotees had been deputed to be his guard for a while to make sure he was okay. So I went up to him and I said, what happened that day? What do you remember? And Kanji Swami told me this. He said, we didn't know what the problem was. He was babbling incoherently and seemed very agitated. Bhagavan asked me to keep an eye on him because he didn't look like he was capable of looking after himself. Bhagavan's darshan sometimes had a very dramatic effect on new visitors. We knew that nothing bad could happen to a visitor while he was under Bhagavan's protection, so I wasn't really alarmed by Muruganar's behaviour. He just needed someone to look after him for a few hours until he calmed down. Oh, this is a lovely picture. Before we go on to the final quote, I found this photo in a scrapbook which Paul Brunton kept when he visited Tiruvannamalai. He had a number of pictures which nobody else seems to have had copies of. I think they just disappeared over time, and Paul Brunton's scrapbook survived and had some of these unique pictures that don't exist anywhere else. So this is Muruganar on the left, Kanji Swami is in the centre, and Yogi Ramaya is on the right. And they've gone to the top of Arunachala to pay their respects to the Deepam fire. That's the cauldron on top of Arunachala, which is lit every year in the Margali month. So this is the final account by Narasimha Swami describing Muruganar's intense experience. He says, a few days later, during the same trip to Tiruvannamalai, when I had no medicine to excite me, I again sat before the Maharshi and had a similar experience. Once again, the figure of the Maharshi became brilliant, and my sense of personality was again submerged. Again, my fears were roused that should I continue in his presence longer, I should be lost to my mother. So at midnight, I hurried from the ashram into the town and spent the night in the house of one of my pupils. So there ends Muruganar's very memorable first visit to Ramanashram. I will stop now, and when I resume with the second of these talks, I will start with the second trip that he made to Ramanashram and Bhagavan 3 months later in December 1923. Thank you.
In the second part of today's program, we will be featuring songs from Ramananjali of Muruganar's Ramana Sannidhi Murai with reference to the talk given by David Godman.
நந்தீசனே வாசகனாயேந்தது கொண்ட உழுவல் மூண்ட அழல் போன்றும் முருகனான் முத்தி நெறிக்கு ஆண்ட கடலன்றி அழியா பரவசத்தில்
சந்தனடை சார்ந்த தமிழ்நாடன் வாசிதர சந்த நிதித்திரளின் தன்ம விசேடத்தால் குருமூர்த்தமாக குலவியதன் கோயில்.
பரமார்த்தமென்ற பணியில் செலவிடவே கிங்கரரால் வேந்தழைக்க கேட்டு மதிமாள்களால் சங்கரனாம் தன்னடியில் சார்ந்து குறை சாற்ற
விலை மதிக்கலாகா விரிசுடர் மாணிக்கம் சலமனத்தன் கண்டு மகிழ்சார முதலுய்த்து நரித்திரளை நாம் அப்பரியாக்கிக் கொண்டோ அரிமர்தனன் செய்யரும் தவத்தால் கண்முன்
மரகத மாணிக்கம் மயங்களிலோடன் சொல் துரகதமா ஊர்ந்தரசன் சோத்த மகிழ்ந்தேற்றருளி கொள்ளுகெனத்தான் கயிறு மாறி கொடுத்தலும்
அன்னள் இரவே முன்னை நரிகளாய் அப்பரிதாம் ஊரை அவல முறுத்து ஊளையிட்டுக் கொண்டோட ஆரை நீ மாயம் செய்தீர் என்றடிகளை வேந்து
உள்ளம் காய்ந்தாற்ற ஒருத்தலுமே வையைக்கள் வெள்ளம் பாய்ந்து ஊர் மேல் விரைவதனைத் தக்க அடியார் இறந்த குறை ஆண்டானாம் தன் பொன்முடியால் நிறைவேற்று மோததயாமூர்த்தி.
அனநியமா தன்னை அடைந்த சரணத்தால் கனநியமச் சான்றோரும் கண்டு தொழத்தக்காள் முதுவந்திக்காளாய் முயன்று முடிமேலே
மதுவந்த பிட்டுக்கு மண் சுமக்கலுற்று பிரம்படி தானுண்ட விசித்திரத்தால் தானே வரம்பிலவாம் 8 வடிவாதல் காட்டி
அமைச்சர் பெருமை அரசர்க்கு உணர்த்தே தமை சிவ வாழ்க்கை கேசரிக்க விடுத்து அப்பால் அழகுமலி தில்லை பொன்னம்பலம் சார் என்ன
கண்ணோக்கம்
எதிகள் 100,000 பணிந்தேத்தும் அதிவன்னாச்சிரம் ஆரியன் போற்றி. யோகமெனும் பேரொளி பிழம்பார் தருதேகமுடை சிவயோகி போற்றி. நளிகடல் போல குளிர் கண்ணோக்கால் ஒளிபடர் ஞானம் உதவுவோன் போற்றி. புன்னகை நிலவின் பொங்கொழியாலே துன்னகையில் உணரத் துறப்போன் போற்றி.
பாவணம் காட்டி பதகனை தன்னடிக்கு ஆவணம் கொண்டென ஆண்டோன் போற்றி. வானவர் காணா மலரடியமக்காய் நானில மீது நடந்தோன் போற்றி. பொய்க்கனவு அதனை சிக்கெனப் பற்றி மிக்கன செய்த வீணனேன் தன்னை உண்மை நெருக்கே ஒழுகுவித்தாண்ட திண்மை சேர் ஞானதேசிகன் சேர்ந்தோர் தராதர நோக்கால் தன்னழியால் எனை நிராகரியாது உயக்கொண்டோன் போற்றி.
தன்பத துணை சார்பரியாது பொய் ஜகத்திடை தடுமாறி. தன்பத துணை சார்பரியாது பொய் ஜகத்திடை தடுமாறி.
துன்பவார்கல்லி தோய்ந்த விதாவிடு சொல்லெழுதொன்னி கேட்டு. துன்பவார்கல்லி தோய்ந்த விதாவிடு சொல்லெழுதொன்னி கேட்டு.
புன்புலம் புரி புழுத்தலை நாயையும் போத வெங்கட நாதல். புன்புலம் புரி புழுத்தலை நாயையும் போத வெங்கட நாதல்.
அன்பிலாண்டு தன் அடியரிற் கூட்டிய அதிசயம் கண்டாமே. அன்பிலாண்டு தன் அடியரிற் கூட்டிய அதிசயம் கண்டாமே.
திருத்தாயவாருமன கற்பனாசூரியமை கண்மணியை கண்காண காஷினிக்கு கண்மணியை கண்காண காஷினிக்கு
திருத்தாயீன்றளித்த தெய்வ தருவான சிவதேவதையாம் மாது பூதேஸ்வரயாம் சிந்தை செய்வோம்.
திருத்தாயீன்றளித்த தெய்வ தருவான சிவதேவதையாம் மாது பூதேஸ்வரயாம் சிந்தை செய்வோம். மாதிருபூதேஸ்வரயாம் சிந்தை செய்வோம். மாதிருபூதேஸ்வரயாம் சிந்தை செய்வோம்.
சிந்தை செய்வோம்.
பார்வளர் கையிலை பருபத நீங்கி பண்ணவர் சூழலை விட்டு பார்வளர் கையிலை பருபத நீங்கி பண்ணவர் சூழலை விட்டு பார்வொளி மணி போல் வாசகர் வாக்கை வளர் செவி மடுத்திட விரும் வளர் பெரும் கண்டுரையடைந்தார் போல் இழிசினேன் புன் சொல்லும் வேட்டு சீர்வளரருணை செழும்பதி சேர்ந்தாய் தேசிகரமண மாதேவே தேசிகரமண மாதேவே பார்வளர் கையிலை பருப்பத நீங்கி பண்ணவர் சூழலை விட்டு
இருவராம் தெய்வ பெரியரால் அறியா இவுரு எதற்கென தள்ளி இருவராம் தெய்வ பெரியரால் அறியா இவுரு எதற்கென தள்ளி பருகலாம் அனித்த படிவமே கொண்டு பணிந்தெழும் அடியவர் தமக்கு கருவனாதருள கங்கணம் பூண்டு கச்சையும் அதற்கென கட்டி திருவண்ணாமலையில் சிறக்க வீற்றிருந்தாள் தேசிக ரமண மாதேவி
தேசிக ரமண மாதேவி பார்வளர் கையிலை பருப்பத நீங்கி பண்ணவர் சூழலை விட்டு
தெருக்கடை அலைந்து திரியும் நான் போல தேர்ந்தது தேர்ந்து தெருக்கடை அலைந்து திரியும் நான் போல தேர்ந்தது தேர்ந்தது தேர்ந்து பெருக்குடையல்லா பிறப்பினும் பிறந்து பெருந்துயரிடும் வைகள் புலந்து கருக்கடை கதியா காத்து நிற்பேனை கடை கணித்தியானெனதென்னும் செருக்கர ஒழித்து திருப்பதம் அளிப்பாய் தேசிக ரமண மாதேவே தேசிக ரமண மாதேவே பார்வள கையிலை பருப்பத நீங்கி பண்ணவர் சூழலை விட்டு
வாரொளி மணி போல் வாசகர் வாக்கை வளர்செவி மடுத்திட விரும்பி சேர்வளர் பெரும் கண்டுரையடைந்தார் பால் இழிசினேன் புன் சொல்லும் வேட்டு சீர்வளருணை செழும்பதி சேர்ந்தாய் தேசிக ரமண மாதேவே தேசிக ரமண மாதேவே தேசிக ரமண மாதேவே தேசிக ரமண மாதேவே.
ரமணனி காட்சி பற்பல காட்டினாய் மன கண்ணுளே ரமணனி காட்சி பற்பல காட்டினாய் மன கண்ணுளே அண்டினாக்கு நன்றாற்றுகின்ற அருட்பெருங்கடல் அண்ணலே அண்டினாக்கு நன்றாற்றுகின்ற அருட்பெருங்கடல் அண்ணலே தொண்டு பூண்டு துணை மலர்பதம் துன்னினேத்து ரமணனி தொண்டு பூண்டு துணை மலர்பதம் துன்னினேத்து ரமணனி கொண்ட புன்னகை கூடு நின் முகம் கூர்ந்து நோக்கிய காலையில் கண்டிலாத கண்காட்சி பற்பல காட்டினாய் மன கண்ணுளே ரமணனி காட்சி பற்பல காட்டினாய் மன கண்ணுளே மாசிலாத குணத்து மாதவர் வாழ்த்துகின்ற திவாகரா மாசிலாத குணத்து மாதவர் வாழ்த்துகின்ற திவாகரா ஆசிலாத நல்லன்பினால் உனை அண்டினேற்கு ரமணனி ஆசிலாத நல்லன்பினால் உனை அண்டினேற்கு ரமணனி ஏசிலா எழில் ஏந்த நின் முகம் என்று நோக்கிய வேல்வையில் காசிலாத கண்காட்சி பற்பல காட்டினாய் மன கண்ணுளே ரமணனி காட்சி பற்பல காட்டினாய் மன கண்ணுளே நாமரூபனய பிலாத மெய் ஞான யோகியர் நாதனே நாமரூப கற்பனைய பிலாதமை ஞான யோகியர் நாதனே சேமமுற்ற சிவம் என உனை தேரினேற்கு ரமணனி சேமமுற்ற சிவம் என உனை தேரினேற்கு ரமணனி வாமமுற்ற நின் வான்முகத்தை மகிழ்ந்து நோக்கிய வைகல்வாய் காமருற்ற கண்காட்சி பற்பல காட்டினாய் மன கண்ணுள்ளே ரமணனி காட்சி பற்பல காட்டினாய் மன கண்ணுள்ளே ரமணனி காட்சி பற்பல காட்டினாய் மன கண்ணுள்ளே
அத்தனே எங்கோ பரமனே எங்கோ பரிவுடை கிறிஸ்துவே எங்கோ முத்தனே எங்கோ முனைவனே எங்கோ முகமது நபி என மொழிகோ வித்தனே எங்கோ விமனனே எங்கோ வீர கோதம முனி எங்கோ அத்தனே எங்கோ குமரனே எங்கோ வண்ணலே ரமணமா தேவே சூரியனே ரமணமா தேவே வள்ளலே ரமணமா தேவே அத்தனே எங்கோ பரமனே எங்கோ அறிவுடை கிறிஸ்துவே எங்கோ
முத்தனே எங்கோ முனைவனே எங்கோ முகமது நபி என மொழிகோ
வித்தனே எங்கோ விமலனே எங்கோ வீர கோதம முனி எங்கோ
அத்தனே எங்கோ குமரனே எங்கோ
வண்ணலே ரமணா மாதேவே
சூரியனே ரமண மாதேவே வள்ளலே ரமண மாதேவே
We look forward to David Godman's sharings on Muruganar and Bhagavan in the next 2 talks. We continue the series on Ramananjali 40+ with a sharing from Srimati Mahalakshmi Suryanandan on Monday. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya.